Go to the beach, stay home. Go to a protest, stay home. Go to a house party, stay home. Go to a rally for Trump, stay home. Go to school, stay home. We're in a massive national divide about how far to go, how far not to go. And that divide is defined 100% in my mind by masks. Wear the mask, don't wear the mask. People walking into Targets, refusing to wear a mask, and then pulling out knives and guns. And people just not knowing which way's up or down. The governor of Georgia sues the mayor of Atlanta over a mask mandate. States are saying you can't make people wear masks. Localities are saying we will make people wear masks. And all of it goes back to February when Dr. Anthony Fauci said, you don't need to wear masks. And then suddenly we did. And today he says, well, I only said that because I didn't think we'd have enough masks. Masks, to me, define the social anxiety that we are all going through. And today we're going to talk about that, about anxiety, about depression. I've got an incredible guest, a neurosurgeon, a really brilliant mind, doing some really interesting things in the space. It's Rob Nelson. This is Rob Nelson Live.
Meet Rob Nelson, talk show host.
Because you got the 70s thing going there. My name's Rob Nelson. I used to have a talk show on Fox, a show on Fox News. But news in America is so produced. I don't care if you think it's left, right, center, fake. You passed tougher legislation to deal with the paparazzi after what happened with you and your family.
I think it's very important that we focus on rebuilding.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm Rob Nelson. This is Rob Nelson Live. And let me just jump right into it because I want to get to Dr. Mark Leiker, who's a neurosurgeon, and I want to get right into mental health. But first, interesting time. Sometimes you look at a day in history. Today isn't the one, but yesterday, July 16th was. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown. July 16th in our American history. 1790, July 16th is when they actually dedicated the space on the Potomac River, which would become Washington, D.C. They said this will be the permanent capital of the United States. 1945, on July 16th, we detonated the first test nuclear bomb in the deserts in New Mexico. 1969, on July 16th, Apollo 11 took off for the moon. Be the first moon landing. Pretty amazing events, all on July 16th. 1980, July 16th, Ronald Reagan wins the nomination doesn't become president, wins the nomination of the Republican Party, and then will launch the Reagan Revolution when he becomes president. And in 1964, Barry Goldwater, a lot of you may not know who Barry Goldwater was, especially if you're younger, but Barry Goldwater ran for the Republican nomination for president in 1964, and he was kind of an iconoclastic Republican. And he said this in his speech: extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. If that doesn't say everything about where we're at right now in America, because we're at a time where people are choosing to go extreme in their defense of what they call their liberty. And we're having a massive argument about it. Like, I don't have to wear a mask. And I've said before, put the effing mask on. Even if you don't think it's useful, do it to be respectful of other people. Walk in a store, put a mask on. Common sense, you don't need science to tell you it's going to help. I mean, if you have any kind of virus, it's going to help. Put a mask on. People don't want to. They feel like it's attacking their liberty. They don't want to, because liberty is being attacked in some ways. People are being told you can't go to work, you can't go to church, but you can go to a protest. I went to the protests. Thousands of people packed up on my head. Don't tell me that wasn't spreading the virus. Literally, it was like a massive humanity. Way, 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 way worse than the gym. Way worse than any beach on Memorial Day. Worse even than a Trump rally, believe it or not. But liberty is being challenged. But on the other side, people are saying we want justice, and the whole Black Lives Matter thing is a push for justice. And, you know, pushing for people who want justice go, I can't be kind of half and half. Got to be all in. We got to be extreme to get justice. But that's a battle. That's a tension we are in right now. And a lot of it does come around the mask stuff and around the protest stuff and around what we can and can't do and who we do and don't trust. Meanwhile, you know, people just don't know what to believe. Millions of people are out of work. Millions of businesses aren't coming back. I know some really smart, really successful business people who are fine. I call it the two Americas. The people, they got nothing to worry about. They'll get through anything. And they're not sure this country will bounce back from this. They're looking at the big picture going, I don't know. We might not. Economically, we could not. But if you're an average person, you're going, I feel that. Don't know. I can't pay my rent. Can't pay my mortgage. Don't know. My retirement fund's gone if you're old enough to have one. Not sure if I'll ever get my job back. Not sure if my business will ever come back up. Millions and millions of people are on edge. Plus, they're living packed in their houses. If you have a big, giant house with a beach, you're fine. But what if you're crammed in and your kids are crammed in and they can't go back to school this year? There's 7 of you living in an apartment and you basically can't go anywhere. What does that do to your brain? 50% of Americans say, I am depressed and anxious over the virus. 1,000% increase in calls to a federal emergency health center around anxiety and depression. That was in May. That May was like a summer break compared to where people are at today. Right? Talkspace, which is an online therapy center, said they're getting 65% increase in patients. And meanwhile, suicides are popping. Whether it's Lorna Breen, who was the ER doc in New York City, no history of mental health issues, just couldn't take it anymore. Went to her family's house, went back, and then just went home and killed herself. And she's just one of many. Captain America, I talked about it last week or Wednesday. Captain America, the famous, sort of symbolic Green Beret, Mr. I got it all. Last week blew his brains out. Just couldn't take it anymore. You hear about the celebrity high-profile suicides. Think of all the ones you don't hear about. The ones that don't make the news. Before I bring on my guest, I want to play a very short TikTok video. This is me on the street before everything got so dark. You got to pick your way of dying, and you get one of 3 choices. You can be shot, you can drown, or you can get shoved off a cliff.
I want to be shot.
Shot?
I want to get shoved off the cliff.
Shoved off the cliff? So you want the view? So
yeah. That sounds so fun.
Right? Yeah.
That was when it was funny to talk about dying. That's like 7 months ago. It's not funny anymore. Captain America, Lorna Breen, Steve Bing, the big Hollywood producer, jumped off a building. TikTok star, Jess Waters, the writer for This Is Us. All people who appeared to have great lives. Elvis's grandson, don't know if he was happy or not, but those are high profile. What about the rest of the people? The rest of the people. I suffer from mental depression my whole life. Trust me, I know how dark it is. And if your normal, healthy people are feeling this, how dark it is for some of you, and we don't know what to do, who to talk to, where to turn. It's a tough time. Want to welcome on the show Dr. Mark Leiker. He is a neurosurgeon. He's at the Keck School of Medicine at USC and is a neurosurgeon with a neurological practice. Is it the California Institute of, say it for me, Mark.
California Neurosurgical Institute.
California Neurosurgical Institute, and is doing some really interesting things with the brain. Mark, before we get into the stuff you're doing to help with depression, talk to me about some of what I said in terms of the high level picture of what you see as a doctor with depression and the times we're in. And then let's weave that into the fact that at some level, it's our brains doing this to us. People feel like, I don't know what to do, right? Our brains don't know what to do right now. Why?
Right. Well, I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. But, I think relative to those types of professionals, I think I have a lot more experience with brain and brain functions, specific brain functions, than most of them. And we don't think about it, but we know that it's happening. The brain is processing information all the time, and then trying to understand, try to make sense of all that information, and create some sort of a reaction. And so people are afraid now. People are, many of them are depressed. Pain is increased as well because there's a correlation between the experience of pain and depression. People don't know who to turn to. There are so many more people that are having more and more trouble nowadays, even if they had some element of depression before, it's really exacerbated. I have friends, family members, aside from patients that are experiencing a lot of trouble in this area. I also do a lot of spine work, and so I see, there's been an influx of patients with a lot of pain, and it's pain that I can't really define necessarily. Neck pain, back pain, radiating pain to the arms and legs. It's interesting. There's something going on. This is something that obviously very, very few of us have ever experienced in society right now.
So wait, Mark, you're saying you're seeing an increase, a spike in pain, say spinal pain, whatever, that is being caused. They don't know. It's not like I had an injury, now I'm getting spinal pain. It's almost like their depression or anxiety or something inside their brain is causing them to feel pain in another part of their body.
Well, I think it started, they probably had some element of pain to begin with, but they were going about their lives. Everything was fine. They may be taking some ibuprofen or something like that. But what happens over the course of time, especially with depression, is that your perception of pain actually changes and it magnifies. And, when patients say, well, I hear this all the time, Doc, it's not my brain. I really do have this pain. And I say, well, of course it is your brain. It's your brain that's experiencing the pain and communicating that to you. We hear stories about people who are able to tolerate high levels of pain. And then there are people who are extremely sensitive to pain. And so it's really the processing system of the brain, which processes pain, which processes emotions, which processes external occurrences, the external environment, relationships in a certain way. And we respond based on that processing.
So two things. One is, I think we don't, well, first, so your point about psychiatrists and psychologists, and I'm not knocking psychiatrists or psychologists. I've been to many of them throughout my life. Some of them were better than others. Psychologists try to work with you in a certain way. Psychiatrists try to medicate you and work with you in a certain way. But you and I have talked about this before. There is, to me, it's always been interesting because a psychiatrist or a psychologist doesn't typically know why you feel from a brain point of view, why you're going through what you're going through. They may try to understand your life experience and they may get it right, they may get it wrong. But if you're a person who's dealing with, certainly if it's clinical depression before this whole thing, they can't tell you why your brain is doing it. They can just throw some things at the wall and hope, we know this worked here, let's try it here. Well, that didn't work for you, let's try these two cocktail combination. Oh, that didn't work. Well, let's try this. And it's always struck me as like a total hit and miss. So I'm not knocking them because they're obviously trying to help with mental health. But as a person who's dealt with it my whole life, I was always like, well, you don't really understand why my brain is doing this for sure. So you can't fix it the way if you sent me to a guy because I had a bent up knee and you sent me to an orthopedic and said what he could look and go, well, here's what's out of place. Here's the options, fix it or we can't. Right. We only are now beginning to understand more why the brain does what it does with depression, right, and anxiety.
Right, and the brain is a black box, and I'm fortunate to be in a subspecialty where we actually have access to that black box. We can see neural interactions that occur on a real-time basis through the electrical responses that we see. It's a tremendous.
Back up and explain that, Mark. Back up and explain that to people who say that again in layperson's terms. What are you actually seeing happen?
Yeah, so I should back up. So I'm a neurosurgeon who specializes in functional neurosurgery, and there are really a handful of us in LA, and really a very small number in the country and in the world. And our specialty is basically putting electrodes in certain parts of the brain to change an abnormal circuit. That's the best way to explain it. So most of our patients are Parkinson's patients, and you can imagine a patient with tremor. We put an electrode in the brain in the right location, and the tremor stops. Most of us know Parkinson's patients. We see the tremor, they're stiff. There are a variety of symptoms and signs that go along with that. So if you think about it that way, it's a very powerful tool. So if you can identify the abnormal circuit that causes either a movement problem, a movement disorder, or a psychological, emotional problem, if you know that circuit and you can intervene by placing an electrode in the circuit, then that's what, imagine the power there. You can change the output of that abnormal circuit. And so best example, a few months ago, I operated on a kid with Tourette syndrome. And many people are familiar with Tourette's. Patients have that horrible tic and they curse. And, 100 years ago, those types of people they'd live in the woods. They wouldn't be able to function in normal society because nobody understood it then and very few people understand it now. But we can put electrodes in the brain to change the output of that very abnormal circuit, and they can look pretty normal, pretty close to normal.
Right.
That's a perfect example.
So we look at, again, and Tourette's. So in general with mental health, the Tourette's is interesting, and I don't want to get too much into one thing, except there was a documentary a few years ago about a swim team, and one of the kids had Tourette's on the swim team. And it was fascinating because he would literally go off on his friends, and he knew what he was doing, but he couldn't stop it. Like he'd say, I shouldn't have said that, should I have? After he literally swore at them, called them a bunch of horrendous names, whatever the most profane, racist, horrible thing he could say, he would say and go, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that. And they'd be like, no, we know. But it struck me as like he can't control his brain, yet his brain knows enough to come up with the most offensive thing to say. It's not like he calls a black person a honky. He knows to use the N-word. He knows to cut, but he has no control. Which always fascinated me that our brains are kind of almost sort of supersized over us doing something and we really can't fully direct it. It's almost, I was like, what is it? Brain in charge?
Right. So that's a great example to focus in on psychological problems. Let's say you're walking in the street and someone accidentally just brushes your shoulder. Some people would say, hey man, what was that about? Or they may not even notice. And some people would be violent. And that decision making is actually part of the very primitive part of the brain that's involved in reward anticipation, in decision making, in the modulation of emotions. I mean, you think how primitive, how fundamental that kind of stuff is. It's not, I'm reaching my hand over to pick up a cup. It's how I respond to what I see around me.
Am I hardwired that way? Am I hardwired to have a guy hit my shoulder and go, "What's up, dude? No big deal," or go, that's it. I'm on you. Like I'm gonna really fuck you up because you just hit my shoulder and you're assaulting me. Is that hardwired? Is it behaviorally trained? Because I feel sometimes like certain people just have a trigger switch that goes off way faster than say mine does about certain things.
Yeah. And there's a bell curve. And, at this point in our understanding of how the brain works, we have no idea how to modulate that kind of response, except, in a very violent person, you've heard of, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You would do, you would basically cut a slice through the frontal lobe, and the person would become very docile. Mm-hmm. But that's not a real life. That's not a good life. And that's kind of, that's an extreme surgery. But nowadays, when you think about that, we can maybe do a very focused surgery with an electrode to change that abnormal response, that violent behavior. And we're kind of entering in the realm of what we call psychosurgery, which, has very negative connotations. If you look at the history of psychosurgery in California, for instance, there was a group, Freeman and Watts, who were one was a psychiatrist, one was a neurosurgeon, and this was back, I think, in the 60s, 70s, and I think there's a movie coming out about it. But I'd love to see it. But basically, you could bring your mother-in-law to the hotel room, and they would take an ice pick and put it up through the roof of her eye, of her orbit, and create a frontal lobotomy. So that's a very gross.
We think of psychosurgery, we think of lobotomies. Right. And obviously we're moving past that. So I want to get to some of this stuff in a minute, but I really want to dig in a little on the part of us that for the first time as a nation, as a world, I feel, again, I've owned that I'm a depressed person. I've struggled with it since I was a very young child, with a clinical kind of depression that I battle. And I used to struggle with trying to explain to people what it was because they didn't get it. Like, they're like, well, just choose to be happier. And I'd be like, I can't choose to be happier today. Like, the best thing in the world could happen to me, and I still feel this. I feel for the first time, millions of people understand that. It's unfortunate, Mark, that they understand it, but they're getting it in that they're like, I have feelings of depression and anxiety I cannot explain. And I don't know what to do with them, right? So are we at a point, Mark, where we're starting to maybe have a window where people will accept that what goes on in our brains is not 100%, maybe not even a little as much in our control as much as we think. Do you know what I'm asking? I mean, in other words, like people maybe start to accept that mental illness and mental health stuff is a little out of our control, but they still resist it. We still think somehow you can fix it. But is it actually almost all out of our control? Like, is it really just our brain deciding, how we're wired, how, why, happy people are going to feel depressed right now because of the stress and the anxiety going on in their world? Is it just their brain doing that?
Well, yes, of course, it is the brain doing that, but we do have control to some extent over our brain. So if you compare us to a primitive organism, a lobster, an amoeba, 99 out of 100 times you give them a stimulus and they will respond a certain way. And the difference between animals and humans is that we have a developed frontal lobe. We have a frontal cortex that can hopefully judge the response to a certain emotion. And so how you respond to that external stimulus is really the key here. So if let's say your frontal lobe is, I hate to say more developed, but just differently connected with the emotional center of the brain, you might, if you're hit on the shoulder walking past someone, you might immediately say to yourself, okay, what kind of response do I do right now? If you can just kind of think a second time, what is it that how am I going to respond to this? Who is this guy? All right, he really doesn't know me. I don't need to start a fuss and a mess here and get into a fight. So that's what the frontal lobe does. The frontal lobe helps to modulate the primitive, and again, we're dealing with, in terms of depression, it's a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is and there are others that are connected with this, but very primitive parts of the brain that need to be regulated. And if we let these primitive parts run free, we've got chaos. If our frontal lobes are working well, we have, let's say, a more stable society.
So talk show hosts like me, we have really developed frontal lobes. Because we're good at okay. I want to show a short video. It's a little under a minute. I couldn't go get this on the street, so it's something I did, obviously pre-pandemic. It's just a stand up to camera. I want to show it to everybody. It sort of sets up. Remember, this is a year ago, so take it in context to how much worse it is today. And it's about suicide, Mark. And then I want to talk a little about that, and then talk about some of the treatments that we can be doing. Sure. I'll never forget the phone call where I was standing when my sister called and told me my brother had committed suicide. In the last couple of weeks, we've had the suicides of a couple of very high-profile people, Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. And particularly in the case of Anthony Bourdain, somebody who kind of many people felt was like inspiring them to live life to the fullest, to take it in, to go on a journey. He would kill himself. These successful, accomplished people who appear to have everything, including kids, would kill themselves. I thought about that with my brother. He was in a lot of pain, but I never thought he'd kill himself. Suicide rates are rising everywhere in this country, with young people, with vets, and clearly with people who are very successful. Why? We say mental health, we need to deal with mental health. That's almost like a canned answer. Why are people killing themselves more and more? What's so dark about life right now? What's so toxic about it? And what can we do about that? So Mark, that was before the pandemic. Now, people would be like, "Oh, I'll tell you what's so toxic." Like, what's so toxic is that like the whole world is falling apart around me. I've lost everything. I'm afraid of losing everything. I can't go out. I can't connect with human beings. I'm terrified to walk down the street. I don't know what to believe. I don't know whether to think some guy walking by me is going to give me the disease or no one's going to give it to me. It was already happening that people were getting a little overwhelmed and crazy. Suicide rates have gone up 30% in the last 20 years before this. So before we get to the specific ways you can treat stuff with the brain, and I know you're not a psychiatrist, but you also are a person who knows the brain. Are we at risk because of just the nature of society, the complexity, the amount of information, the number of inputs we have combined with this global crisis? Are we at risk of a serious mental health epidemic that is going to just keep spiraling and getting worse?
Well, it's a good question. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but
By the way, a psychiatrist may not have a better answer than you. And truthfully, you may not know the answer because who does, but you actually do know how the brain works and can go, it's possible our brains are starting to reach an overload.
Yeah. I mean, I have a little daughter, I have a son too. And, you can see the amount of information that's bombarding their brain on a minute by minute basis when they're online or, on some app and Instagram, Facebook, etc. And it's got to have, I mean, our brains are just not capable of gating, of filtering all that information in the right way. And so I think that's got to contribute to some of the depression that we're seeing. And also, I think being disjointed from family, friends, because, you see these comedies about, a family of four sitting around a table, all looking at their iPhones. That's not great. You need to create that connection. And so it's very sad. And I think it's terrible that, the kids are out of school now, because it's very different going to school on Zoom versus having the kids in school, making those connections with friends. These are developing brains we're talking about. They need that interaction. They need that human interaction. And this is something that their brains have been doing for whatever, tens of thousands of years, as our species developed. And now we've totally shut them off from that. And so there's when you don't have that physical, that intimate connection, there's a feeling of hopelessness, helplessness, this disjointedness that I think is contributing to what we see. I think you see not only that, a rash of ADD in kids, especially boys, but girls as well. And it seems to all come down to, well, what medication can we give the child to change this? And I don't think that's necessarily the answer. I think the medications can help to a certain degree, but I think we're missing a lot. I mean, we don't understand so much of the brain.
Right. And so to the school thing, so this is a tough one because obviously everything in our country right now is politicized, right? And it's sad because science has become politicized, right? I mean, both sides say, follow the science, follow the science. I said on my Wednesday show, it's like science has become God. It's like follow God. It's like science isn't one thing, and you can interpret science a lot of different ways. You can take the facts of this virus, that it's highly transmissible and that we don't, that it has very severe effects on certain people, and we don't have a vaccine, and that's science. And you can take the science that says the likelihood of a person under 19 dying is almost, statistically insignificant, so children are safe. Those are both scientific facts, but we politicize it. So going back to school has become a political battle. But the reality is, right, there are arguments to be made for re-engaging in society, if you put the Trump versus non-Trump aside, that are really good for the brain. Like, kids need to be in school. People need to interact socially. Like, you can't function out of that, even if there's a risk involved. Or am I being naive and just being like, well, that's easy for you to say. You're not maybe as risk of getting it.
No, I as someone who has children, I completely agree. I mean, when you think about, people in prison, if they're put in isolation, that's the worst punishment you can get. Why is that? You drive yourself crazy because you lose that physical and emotional interaction that really makes you human and grounds you and tells you that everything's okay. And now we're isolated. I used to live in Manhattan, and I can imagine what they're doing out there, living in small apartments. It's got to be extremely difficult to maintain their level of sanity.
Where do you stand, not to get into the politics, but on the mask thing as a doctor, one, and being in hospitals, you're obviously exposed. I mean, you're not in an ER, but you're exposed because you're in a medical environment. You're exposed to different people, different patients, the whole thing. And you obviously inside there have a lot of protection with having a clean room and all. But like, you have kids, as you said, where do you, obviously I'm sure you wear a mask when you go in a store, but like, do you see, I had a woman walk by me the other day and literally she saw that I didn't have a mask on and she put her hands up and I was like 5-6 feet away from her. And I was thinking, you're not going to get this disease from me walking by you 6 feet away on a street. It's not like it's going to leap off my head and land on you. I'm not talking to you. I'm not looking at you. And I was like, she was terrified that she could somehow get it by being literally in my proximity for a half a second as I passed her.
Right. Well, the problem is that there's been so much politicization of the mask issue. I wear a mask in surgery, of course. Well, why is that? There's a slight risk if the patient has, let's say a trauma patient, they have hepatitis or they have HIV. I still need to operate on the patient. I want to cover myself to protect myself. And I don't want to, accidentally spit on the patient and, cause an infection in the open wound. So there's a good reason for me to wear it in surgery, and there's good science behind it, of course. But there's really not much science with regard to wearing a mask outside. So I think what the answer should be is do the smart thing. If you're going to be around people, not a bad idea to wear a mask. But I joke with my friends, well, no one's really defined what a mask is. Let's say an N95 mask, it protects 95% of the droplets coming out. Well, what is a regular mask or a wool mask or a cotton mask or whatever that you buy in the store or online? Is it an N20? So 80% of the bacteria can flow through the mask? Or what if I wrap toilet paper around my face? I mean, is that really, double ply? But, is that enough to really protect, from carrying a virus, which is a tiny, tiny particle?
Right.
So and not a lot. Right. And that's why people are afraid.
And right. And that's what they don't understand. And also, I think where it becomes almost a psychological protection, but it's also created a massive fear of human contact. And I've even thought, I was stunned like 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, when the World Health Organization said, we are close to deciding whether we think it's an airborne virus. And I was stunned because I was like, what do you mean? Didn't we already decide it was an airborne virus? And then I realized, wait, so they're not even sure it's an airborne virus, which means, just so everybody gets what I'm getting at here, meaning if it's not airborne, you can't get it just because I walk by you on the street. I'd have to actually have a particle hit you. But I think most of us assumed it was an airborne virus, like that it's floating around out there.
Right. Well, I think you in your opening, which was great. You mentioned Dr. Fauci, who is the world's expert, one of the world's experts on viruses. And he came out initially and said, don't worry about the masks. Well, if it's an issue of not enough masks, people are buying wool masks, cotton masks, whatever. Right. So he could have said, look, do what you can to protect your droplet production.
Yeah, I don't buy that, by the way. I don't buy his now saying, I don't know, one can criticize him. He's like the Pope, but and I'm not criticizing him. I think he probably is an amazing epidemiologist. I think he doesn't think in terms of anything but epidemiology, which means I don't think he processes how much it costs to keep kids out of school or to have millions of people lose their jobs. I think he just sees a disease and how to deal with it and what's best, which is his job. But I don't buy that he didn't know he thought it was really bad, but didn't say it because he didn't want to create a crisis of a shortage. I don't buy that. It's like, I think they thought it's okay. It's not, mask's not going to really help in this case. Right. That's right.
Right. Well, look, the good point is, again, not to be political, but you have military leaders who give the president information about a particular, worldwide issue, and the president makes a decision. And I think similarly here, scientists are specialists in what they know, but I don't think, with all due respect to Dr. Fauci, who's a phenomenal guy, of course, phenomenal scientist and expert in this area, making that decision about about school openings and risk to kids outside of the viral risk. We know that kids are not dying. Very, very, very few kids are dying of this.
Just to be clear, Mark, let me ask you, because you are a doctor, to say that to people, right? The risk of a child, because the news will say, oh, a perfectly healthy 18-year-old got it and died. And I'm like, okay, a perfectly healthy 18-year-old jumped out of an airplane 3 days ago in a tandem shoot, and both chutes didn't open, and she and the guide instructor died. Like, statistical anomalies happen. It's highly, highly unlikely that a young, healthy child would ever die of this, right?
Right. Yeah, the risk is tiny, tiny, tiny. And, again, the risk of, let's say, grandma, okay, no question, protect, 82-year-old grandma, no question about it. But the isolation that grandma must feel, going back to depression, she's sitting there in the same room watching TV or whatever, no interaction with humans. That's terrible too. There's a cost to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard of different stories of older people who literally are like going out and doing whatever, because I think in their mind, they're like, I may get it, but I'm 85. I don't care. I want to live. I don't want to sit locked up. It's like, you should be staying home. And it's like, no, I'm going to live my life because I'm going anyway in the next 10 years. And, it ain't worth it. I thought it was funny. Like, it's almost like old people are more risk-taking than middle-aged people.
Right. They've been through a lot, and they say, look, I don't want to live this life. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the average death, the average age of death for the COVID people, it's the average age is 75. When you compare that to the flu epidemic that we had in 2008, 2009, the average age was 41. So no one wants to kill grandma, of course, but when you think about a 41-year-old dying who's got they've got families, they're in the peak of their work. They've got a lot of things to look forward to. That's they're protecting their kids, they're raising their kids, they're taking care of business. That's a huge loss too. That's a tremendous.
Right. Massive. I want to get to your treatments, but we got a lot of audience interaction. So let's take a couple things. And Bruce, we're going to go through them. Some already were up. Someone on Reddit saying, wouldn't we need goggles or face shields if it's airborne?
Right. So I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm a neurosurgeon. But I mean, I think the problem is that we need people with a scientific mind to evaluate the risks here. And I think there are so many people, going back to the fear and depression, that misunderstand or misinterpret the risks. I know there's some people that talked about the risk of getting this virus in the eye, but the tears are actually very good at killing bacteria and viruses.
The ears are?
Tears.
Oh, tears in your eyes. It's a good thing I cry a lot then. That's good.
Right. And I think really the basic idea is, wash your hands, don't touch your face. If someone is symptomatic with a cough, then generally a dry cough, then they should avoid contact with humans.
But Mark, seriously, and Bruce, let's go back. Also, there was a couple other comments before that. But Mark, it's funny because everybody now thinks every single thing is a symptom, which is funny, right? It's like, and I've suffered from it too. It's like, oh, my leg hurts. I wonder if I have COVID. Oh, I'm feeling a little tired. I wonder if I have COVID. Oh, I have a runny nose. Oh, I have a headache. I mean, literally, it's like everybody thinks everything is a symptom of COVID because somewhere in there, maybe there is a connected symptom. And it's like a whole country walking around going, I wonder if I have it because I woke up with a pain in my back.
Right. Yeah. I've heard of that a lot, and it's unfortunate. It just creates fear. And that shouldn't be. Our government shouldn't be in the business of creating fear. They should really be trying to define the science as best they can and define the risks, and leave it up to the individual to make that decision.
Right.
Around.
That's a great point. Unfortunately, we're so politicized that it's really hard to do that right now. It's really hard. I mean, the science has become politicized. The virus has become, blue and red. Like it's crazy that more, people who identify Republican think this isn't as bad as it is, and people Democrat think it's worse than it is. And so again, I don't know how we get to that point. That's a longer conversation, but a good point. Two comments that came up were around One was this one that's on the screen. Others have just tried to push pills on me without actually listening to my problems. And the one before that was a comment, which I don't know if Bruce can find earlier. It was about someone who said, I'm on the autism spectrum, and it wasn't defined until I was 27. So there it is. And I still struggle, but never got any real therapy or treatment. This might be a nice place to kind of talk a little, Mark, about, some of what you're doing, right? Because that's a kind of case, right, where you could theoretically identify that, right, and do some non-invasive stimulation to deal with that. Am I right or wrong?
Right. And let me preface it by saying something interesting that people don't realize, because we live in this world of everything, everything available to us. People don't die. I mean, it's we live in this incredible world that 100 years ago people couldn't even imagine. And when I bring that to the context of healthcare, I mean, we're living in a very, very special time in the history of man. I mean, when you think about it, 7,500 years ago, you had something as simple as a lumbar herniated disc and leg pain from that. You couldn't work the farm, you couldn't work the fields. I mean, you were stuck. And now, people don't think too much about it. They have a minor surgery and they go back to their lives. But in the history of mankind, we're now at a point in the past, let's say 50, a little bit more, maybe years, where we're actually able to cure diseases. That's a phenomenal thing. We still, the brain is the final frontier, as they say. So there's still a lot that we don't understand about the brain. But we're learning. And the other point is science is a progression. It's not, the science is, here it is. This is the science. This is the fact. Well, no, 10 years from now, we'll have different facts.
How far are we in the brain process, right? So I played that video and I start out because, actually July is also the anniversary of my brother's suicide, basically, like a week before this. And he was in a lot of physical pain from a very severe accident on a motorcycle, and he could never get past the physical phantom pain. And he also had a lot of mental pain, depression and stuff from childhood. I didn't even realize how deep, but I obviously have it too. And it was painful to me that, like, he was such a beautiful soul, and I felt sort of cheated that he couldn't survive. He couldn't hold on any longer. And you hear that often, Chester Bennington, the singer of Linkin Park. I remember talking to his ex-wife. I don't know if you call her an ex-wife. I mean, she didn't divorce him. He died. And about a year ago. And she was saying, Rob, don't say he committed suicide. You guys, Chester Park, if you don't know, it was the Linkin Park lead singer who, very high profile kind of suicide. And she said, I like to say he died by suicide. Why do we make it sound like suicide is something you did to yourself? You didn't commit cancer on yourself. You died of cancer. And suicide in her mind was you died by it because it's a disease you couldn't control. And I thought that was really powerful. At first I resisted, and then I was like, it makes sense, right? Like, we don't understand enough about the brain yet, but theoretically we could, to where you could turn off the need to go to such a dark place and do the one thing you're biologically wired not to do, which is end your life. Are we close? Are we even halfway there? I mean, in my lifetime, are we going to figure that out and I can rewire my brain, or are we, where are we?
I think this is a stretch, but I'm going out on a limb here, but I think we will be there in your lifetime, my lifetime. We're about the same age. So I think we really will be there. I mean, for instance, I can put an electrode in your brain and make you frightened or make you happy.
Wait, you can put it in my brain and make me scared?
Yeah.
You put it in my brain and I'm perfectly fine, and suddenly I'm terrified.
Correct.
Just of whatever. I don't know what I'm terrified of. I just feel terror.
Right. Now, that circuit that we're in, where I place the electrode, is not very well defined, and but we're learning so much about very primitive circuits in the brain. I mean, fear is one of the most primitive emotions.
But I want to be clear. I would feel fear. This is almost like a sci-fi movie. I would feel fear the same way I would feel fear if something terrifying happened to me. Like, I would literally experience emotional and physical terror inside.
Right. Yeah, it's exactly the same.
Or joy.
Right.
You could just put it in my head and suddenly I just feel ecstatically happy, even though you're chopping my finger off at the same time.
Well, there are a lot of inputs to the brain if I'm doing a few things like that. But it can happen. It's happened. I mean, it is a real intervention now.
So if you can do that, why couldn't you? Wow, that's fascinating. So you could turn the joy input up on any person.
Yeah. So we don't know what that looks like long term. In the short period of time that we have the patient on the operating table with the electrode in the brain and turned on, the patient can feel happy or fear or sadness. And I don't know anyone in my field who has left the electrode in the brain. But you can see what that really is.
I'm going to sign up.
It wouldn't be a bad idea. Yeah.
And leave it in there. And let me just walk around and feel happy for the next 6 months straight.
Right. So it's we're modulating, again, a very primitive part of the brain. We don't really know what we're doing, but we get a result that, is really fascinating. And so we're really close. I mean, I really think that within a very short period of time, because let me give you another reason. I think we're very close to it because the risks of this type of surgery is so low that we're going to be doing this more and more. I've been doing.
How invasive is it?
Yeah, so I've been doing deep brain stimulation for about 20 years now, when I remember when we started, mostly for Parkinson's disease, I'd have a long discussion with a patient about the procedure itself and the risks, and the patient would say, "Geez, you're going to put an electrode in my brain, and I just have Parkinson's. Can I take a pill?" And that was 20 years ago. Nowadays, people come to me and just say, "Okay, what are you planning on doing? How does it work?" Great. I've seen the videos. It's like society has changed their perception of the concept of putting an electrode in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
The way we do it, simply put, is we drill a small hole, and using a navigation system, we advance the electrode in the right target in the brain. And that's critical. It's location, location, location. You have to be in the right target. If you're not in the right target, you won't get the right effect. And so it's critical to identify, where you want to.
Could you kill a person if you put it in the wrong place?
Sure.
This is why I don't do brain surgery.
Yeah. Well,
no, I'm kidding. But I mean, obviously, you're a brain surgeon. I've said this before, you probably are used to being a brain surgeon. So you're like, whatever. I think being a brain surgeon is like being a rocket scientist. It's like most of us couldn't do what you do, which is, to your credit, it's highly specialized, but you also understand the brain in a highly specialized way. Are we at the point where that implant is getting close to the same as, say, a pain implant, or other procedures, that are more common to be done as medical practice?
Absolutely. When you think about it, the brain is made up of billions of circuits. And the problem is it's a black box. We don't really have a way of identifying this circuit does this, that circuit does that. We know some very gross ideas about big circuits, what they do. And, a lot of neurosurgery in terms of this type of functional neurosurgery is developed serendipitously, just luck. But right now we do put electrodes in the brain for Parkinson's, for tremor, for dystonia, which is a type of movement disorder like cerebral palsy, for epilepsy, for OCD, for depression, for pain.
Wow. For pain too.
And for pain, yes.
So let's talk
really severe.
For really severe pain.
Yeah.
Right. That would probably be my brother, I'm saying, would have probably qualified for that.
Yeah. Did he have pain and limb pain, arm or leg?
Yeah, all of it. There were days he'd be like, I'd come home to visit the family, and I'd be like, we're just going to go for a ride into the city. Come with us. He's like, I can't. You just sit in the car. He's like, I can't sit. I can't do anything. I'm just, an ex, girlfriend friend of his said she would hear him screaming in the middle of the night. He wouldn't even be awake. He would just
Right.
scream in his sleep. His
Yeah.
whole body was in, he had surgeries and the whole thing. But like, that's a pain they couldn't shut off, right? That's different than mental pain, but it creates mental pain, right? I mean, that physical pain creates a chronic mental pain that's debilitating.
Yeah.
And,
So-
I obviously have the mental pain side of it. So I get that. And I think a lot of people have a combo of both, and some one or the other. And some people are lucky enough not to have either.
Yeah. So just a point about that. It's interesting. We talked a little bit about the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is, what differentiates us from animals. It's the part of the brain that gives us forward thinking, planning, higher levels of cognition. And it's interesting. There have been studies that show that people with chronic pain have a decrease in the width of their frontal cortex. So either the neurons die or the connecting elements of the brain shrivel up, but the thickness of the frontal cortex. So basically, if you segue that into the function of the frontal cortex, the ability of the frontal cortex to carry on its daily activities is limited when you have chronic pain. Chronic pain creates a shrinkage of the frontal cortex.
Interesting.
Cortex, without it, you can't, it's very difficult to live a normal life where you can measure inputs, again, environmental inputs, and modulate them and modulate your emotions.
So as we're nearing the end of this, I want to talk just for a minute about TMS, right, which is a non-invasive treatment, right?
Right.
Fair enough, right? Which is TMS. I always get it pronounced wrong. Transcranial
magnetic stimulation. Yeah.
It's really good. I'm not a neurosurgeon. I have a hard time telling you what procedure we're doing. So that is not, you don't go into my brain. You just put coils on my head.
Correct. So, so what I do in surgery is I put electrodes in the brain that send out an electrical impulse, or think about it like a stimulus. It's a stimulus. It's electrical, and that alters the circuit, whatever it does. I mean, we can go into that more. This is an external source of power. It's a magnet, and it sends a magnetic signal to the surface of the brain, and that changes or alters some of the connections. The theory is that it alters some of the connections that may be abnormal. So the concept of long-term potentiation, meaning creating these connections from one part of the brain to the other part of the brain, that strengthens them. When you think about learning the piano or learning to play golf, you're doing long-term potentiation. You're creating these memories that allow you to, in the future, in a more facile way, carry on those activities.
You're saying it in a layperson's term, it does the same thing where by creating those connections, it can create a connection to a more positive way of thinking or a happier experience than the negative one that keeps getting recycled.
Right. So, and so what in the case of depression, and that's the most common use of TMS.
Yeah, and that's why I want to talk about it, because I think, like I said, I think 80% of the country is feeling depressed right now. Not that they all need that, but I'm just saying we've got a massive depression epidemic going on.
Right. And so what TMS does, the theory is that it reinforces the connection between the frontal lobes we talked about to the emotional contextualization part of the brain, that part of the brain that understands that, the emotional context of stuff going on in the outside world. So if you can strengthen, think about it this way, if you can strengthen the frontal lobes to do what it was meant to do, which is kind of control, how you measure emotion, that's a powerful thing.
So layperson for me, Mark, can you say that without frontal and core lobe? Can you say that in a way a person doesn't understand the brain at all understands? Because it's surface of it, it's like, it sounds so complex. And on the other hand, it sounds a little Frankenstein-y, like what, you put these coils on my head and you hope they hit something the right way. It's like, that sounds like a scam. Like, like, how are you going to know?
Right. So if you think about it this way, the frontal lobe, among many other functions, in the context of, emotions. If you don't have any frontal lobes, your emotions are just running free and wild, right? Frontal lobes are like the braking system in your car to the extent that they measure the emotional activity. And so if your frontal lobes if you have a lot of pain, your frontal lobes aren't, the braking system of the brain, the frontal lobe braking system is, as I mentioned, smaller. And so it's not functioning as well to reduce the emotional, variability, activity that is, perhaps bad for you. And so if we can do something like TMS to reinforce the connection between the frontal lobe, the brake, the measuring device, the thing that limits the emotional activity, and the emotional center of the brain, then I think, then you have a good outcome. And
this is really, you're able to target. This isn't hit and miss. I mean, to the extent that anything in the brain is a hit and miss. This is like putting that electrode in a certain spot and making me feel fear. Like you can target a spot and it will have a desired outcome. You will feel less depressed. Most.
So I've been looking at TMS for quite a while, but what really got me excited is this new system that
TMS been around.
It's been around for probably 15 years, or in the primitive forms even longer than that. But
so is it changed from 15 years ago to what you're doing today? Is it different?
Yeah, dramatically. So 15 years ago,
doing today, or quick 15 years ago and then to today.
Yeah, 15 years. You can magnets have been around for a long time, so you can stimulate with a magnet. You can send power from a magnet to the brain, and you can get a response. And if you stimulate the part of the brain that connects with your hand, you can see your hand move. The problem in the past has been there's no way to navigate. So you want to make sure that you're actually stimulating the right part of the brain every time. People with depression need generally 30, 35 treatments. And so you want to stimulate the same part of the brain every time to reinforce the connection between that frontal lobe that we talked about and the emotional center. And so it's critical to be able to navigate, and I won't go too much in navigation, but basically it gives you a map as to where you are. In the past, we didn't have a map. Now we can have a real-time map. The patient in the treatment can see their own brain. We can see their brain, and we can see exactly where the magnet is stimulating. And that's very important.
So you can target precisely. We have, real quickly, we have some kind of my producer Bruce has an image. We're going to put it up here. And Dr. Leiker, if this image is not good, doesn't work, tell me. But does this help explain a little or not? Using this, can you, for people watching, is that helpful?
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. So, So you can see
that, but you can say where you want, and I can.
Yeah. So the magnet is that figure of 8 thing. It looks like it has 2 eyes and a hat, but it's
the black thing at the top.
Right. So that's the magnet, and the magnet stimulates the frontal lobe. That's the front part of the brain there, and it sends it sends impulses along the tracts that travel from that frontal part of the brain to the emotional center. Those are the regions affected by depression. And so these are natural connections, and all TMS does is it reinforces those connections, just like when you learn a sport or learn how to play piano. You're reinforcing connections that are already there.
So again, to use that example, the sport or a piano, I practice, and suddenly I can do it really well. And I sort of remember everything I learned in practicing, and it comes together. The emotions work the same way. It's almost like it forms a link almost that I learned, went from learning emotion to a thing to the right footwork to suddenly I just do it all effortlessly, and it's one cohesive thing, or play a symphony versus just chords.
Right. Right.
And the brain and emotion works the same way.
Right. So it's interesting. I mean, this is very far in the future, but you can imagine, you can either learn piano by practicing, moving your fingers, reading the notes, or if you had some way of stimulating the exact part of the brain that's being stimulated when you do that, that's the same as learning the piano. So one day in the future, I think this is far, far removed from now, but one day in the future, we'll have a device that will, in a methodological fashion, stimulate different.
So I could learn the piano without practicing.
Exactly. I mean, when you think
Could I
about
learn to play a sport without it too? You could essentially train the brain to know how to do something.
Yeah. I think you'll get there. Obviously, there are muscles involved that have
Mark,
strength and
real
depth.
quickly, is that theory, or is that in fact something we will be able to do? We just don't know how yet. At least say with the piano type thing. I mean, is that just a theory you're going, I can see it, or is that actually going based on the science? We will eventually be able to do that. We just have to figure out exactly how.
I think we'll be able to do it. I don't think it's going to be in our lifetime, but I think we'll be able to do it one day. Yeah.
I'll settle for the getting over the depression thing in my lifetime. I'll take that first step. Let me ask you something before we go, Mark. Are you a person self-described? Would you describe yourself as a person who has struggled with depression in your life or not? Meaning like not everyone feels sad, but I mean, or a person who's more happy-go-lucky. Where on the, we have spectrums for everything. I have my own spectrum for mental health and depression. The far end of the spectrum is people I know who truly are happy-go-lucky. And no matter what happens in their life, even horrible tragedies, their brain processes it so fast and they move to a place very quickly of acceptance and positivity. And it's not on denial to the other end where it's everything so twisted in your head that even on a happy day, you might feel a cloud that you simply, the Winston Churchill, elephant in the room, cloud over his head. Where on the spectrum are you? You're a brain guy, so it must be interesting to know your own brain.
It's funny. I've thought about it, and I am the type of person that needs a lot of brain stimulation. I mean, I like to be involved in a lot of different things, and I find if I go on vacation, look, a couple days sitting on the beach is great, but I need the stimulation that I get from interacting with patients and operating and doing research, and that really gets me going because I don't know what it's like to have a month of vacation, but I think I would get depressed.
So interestingly, I want to go back to the depressing, but that stimulation goes back to the social isolation thing we're going through. If our brains aren't getting stimulated enough in certain ways or the wrong ways, it does it's not crazy that it has a effect on people. Like biologically, mentally, your brain needs certain kinds of connections and things to function and feel okay.
Right. Think about it this way. It's like you need that pilot light on to make sure your stove is going to turn on. And that pilot light, in terms of the brain, is just the normal daily interactions and activities and things that your brain is used to keep it healthy and normal. Once you lose that external stimulus, you get depressed. I mean, depression is just a reduction in the brain activity, essentially. I mean, you can have, you can ascribe it to certain emotional things as well, but depression is a reduction in brain activity, and so I think you need that daily interaction so much.
How is sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. How is a person like me, who I have a very active brain, so my brain doesn't seem like it has a reduction in activity, but I deal with clinical depression? In other words, you're saying either way, the reality is my brain, when it's depressed, is having a reduction of activity. That's just a biological fact.
Well, so there's clinical depression, and then there's how you respond to it. And I don't want to, in your case, you have a very healthy way of responding to the depression by doing stuff, by getting active, by, keeping yourself busy, by doing projects. And that's great. If you have that, facility, if you have that ability to experience that. But, if you're forced to stay indoors and you're forced to watch the same, TV shows, and you're forced, or you're prevented from interacting with other people or, doing whatever you want to do, then that will cause a depression. So you need that release. You need that ability to go out there and stimulate your brain. And that's a big problem nowadays. People just don't have it.
Right.
It's not enough. We need the human interactions. We need the daily stresses of going to work and doing our normal chores.
We want our old stresses back. It's like people want, like, bring back all that stuff I hated. I know people who literally will say that. It's like, I'll take all the bad things that happened before, like in my daily life. Bring them on. Like, they were almost like, right. We didn't know they were helping us.
Kept you going. Yeah.
Dr. Leica, this has been really interesting, fascinating. Last thought, if people are listening or watching who are dealing with anxiety and depression, obviously the quick thing people say is call for help. And I always get dismissive of that only because, you don't necessarily know. You don't know what to say. You don't know what to do. And I'm not saying you shouldn't make a call. Certainly reach out to a friend. My advice always is, if you're that friend, don't try to tell the person, oh, it's going to be okay. Like, allow the person to have the depression, anxiety, embrace it, because telling them it's going to go away only makes you feel worse. Like, you feel like I shouldn't have called. But
right. So it's,
right.
Yeah, it's a joke, that statement, it's going to be okay. So, what's the best way to help people out of depression? It's really in my mind, is to empower them, to give them the hope that there are answers out there. And, I like the idea of TMS because I think there are so many people who have depression who just think, well, I've been on Lexapro, I've been on Prozac, I've been on all these medications and they have side effects and they don't really work. Well, there's other stuff out there. And and your psychiatrist or psychologist may not know about it, may not tell you about it, may not think it's right for you, but you should investigate it yourself. So TMS is a great opportunity, non-invasive, no side effects, totally safe therapy, and it's paid for by insurance for the right patients. And I'd like to take the next step, which is, well, we can put an electrode, we can do deep brain stimulation. We can, if for those patients who haven't benefited from the medication, from TMS, there's still options available. And deep brain stimulation 20, 30 years ago was still at the frontier, but now people are very comfortable with the concept. And, obviously look into all these things and empower yourself to investigate what's best for you.
And where would you recommend people look? Go to your general practitioner? Is that they may not know? Go, you can't get to a psychologist or psychiatrist unless you're seeing one without going through your general practitioner. Is there a resource place you'd say, go look here? I don't think our federal government, one of the notes I wanted to make was, in the trillions of dollars they put out for this stuff, they put a tiny fraction out for mental health stuff. It's almost like, but I think as a society, we've now accepted mental health is a problem we're all facing. So
right.
Easy website, easy couple places to, just last thoughts on that.
It's out there, and it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of family practice, internal medicine doctors about this, and they manage so many patients with chronic pain, with depression. They're interested in other stuff. They're interested in the diabetes, the hypertension, the gout, things of that sort, heart trouble. And they kind of dismiss the mental anguish that depression and chronic pain give you, because they really don't have many options. But when I talk to them and say, look, we can do TMS, we can do transcranial magnetic stimulation for your patients. It's a great option. It's very effective for the right patients. And let me evaluate the patient. Let's talk about it. Let me evaluate the patient who's already failed TMS. Maybe talk about deep brain stimulation for those who are severely affected by depression or chronic pain.
Great. That's helpful.
So we're kind of going around because, with all due respect to them, there's a certain stigma to going to a psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. And the patients think, well, he's just going to give me another medication. What is he really going to do for me? It should be, send the patient for TMS. You do need a psychiatrist to clear the patient, but the answer isn't go to a psychiatrist, change your medication. It's try something new. And this is something that I think holds a lot of value and will hold a lot of value for many patients. And it kind of opens up the opportunities that people don't know about.
Real quickly, are psychiatrists generally in favor of this? I mean, there is a little clash, obviously, right? Traditional psychology and psychiatry, you go over and over and over and you keep getting treated, which has always been to me like not the goal, but that's the motto. What you're offering and what other people are starting to do is ways in which we can cure you of your mental health issues. That puts a psychiatrist out of a job.
I don't think so. I don't think you'll have patients who are depressed, really severely clinically depressed, who are totally off medication, even after something like deep brain stimulation. So I don't think it's going to
not
go
a competition. It's not like psychiatrists would be like, I know nobody literally thinks that way. I don't want to do it because I'll lose business. But like, it's not like in their world, this has become accepted by psychiatrists as this is a positive, healthy, hopeful alternative to my medication or addition to my medications.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, again, I think even, family practice doctors, internal medicine doctors, primary doctors, they're kind of fatalistic about this because they don't know. And I think getting the word out to them, getting their word out to patients who have this severe disorder, gives them a lot of hope that this is a good, effective treatment that they can try. I think there's so many patients out there who are just kind of fatalistic about it. I'm on this medication. I've been on the medication. I just got to deal with, what I've got, and, but you don't.
Which is what I love. You don't. That's the great way to kind of wrap this up. You don't. And Mark, real quickly, there's a question from a Reddit user. Is TMS covered by government health insurance? Medi-Cal, Medicare? Yes.
It is.
Jane Doe, yes, it is covered.
Right.
Dr. Leiker, thank you so much for being on, for sharing your knowledge, your insight. Everybody, I'm going to do a quick wrap up. But I wanted to thank you for coming on. This has been really enlightening for me, for a lot of people. And, thank you. Thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for taking the time to share about it.
My pleasure. Thanks for giving me the format to be able to present the information. And
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Quick wrap up here. Just want to say, TMS, something I'm going to think about trying, but bottom line, whatever you try or don't try, we are in a mental health epidemic right now. There's a crisis, a virus, there's an epidemic there. We've talked about that. And a lot of people said, well, we have another epidemic, which is what's happening to our economy and our jobs and our world's kind of crumbling. That's another epidemic. And a piece of that epidemic is mental health. And it is real. I've said from now, before, I've dealt with stuff my whole life, but I know a whole lot of happy-go-lucky people who are dealing with depression and anxiety, and they don't know where it's coming from. Well, they know, but they don't know why. So multiply that. 50% of people, Americans surveyed, saying, I'm dealing with anxiety, depression. That's gone up. It's a real deal. None of us should be afraid to address it. None of us should be afraid to acknowledge it. No one of you should be scared to say, I'm dealing with this, or to ask someone for help, or to turn to someone and to say, hey, I'm really struggling. If you are struggling, I don't care. Call. Don't say it won't make any difference. Call a friend. Call someone you trust. Just say, listen, I'm just going through some stuff. Call a family. Just take the chance and say, I just want to talk. I'm feeling it. And if you're feeling really bad, say that. You don't have to call the suicide helpline and have them come and put you in a restraint. You can say, I'm just having really dark, scary thoughts right now, if it's gone that far. And I don't want to have them. Just talk to me. What I can guarantee you, anybody who gets that call, just talk to the person. Your job isn't to keep someone alive, but you don't know the power of a human connection. That's simply listening and going, I get it. Or if I don't get it, I understand you must be in a lot of pain. I can just tell you I'm here for you. It's like I always say, when someone dies and you go see a person, someone close to them died, people always go, I don't know what to say. And I always say, well, I've had a lot of people in my life die, and I'll tell you what you say. You don't say it's going to be okay. You don't try and tell them what to do. You don't say, listen, I don't know what to tell you. You say, hey, I get it. There's nothing I can say that's going to make this better, but I want you to know I feel for you. Whatever. That alone makes a person feel heard. And sometimes all people need right now, all they need right now is just to feel heard. We all want to be heard. We all need to be heard. And we all need to be having a real dialogue about our emotional and mental health. I'm Rob Nelson. This is Rob Nelson Live.